Hello, students. Hope you all are doing well. So what I want to do today is I'm going to record a lecture about my research in Arizona. We talked about the Hohokam earlier in the semester, and we kind of presented what you might call the textbook version of it, let's say. But this is actually an area where I've been working for several years and doing some interesting research that doesn't always conform exactly to the textbook version. And so I want to present that to you to kind of give you a little bit of a sense of the kinds of things that I work on and I don't know, the dynamism of the field. Thoughts are constantly changing about this stuff, and the textbooks don't often capture some of the subtleties and the debates that are common in a field like this. So let me load up a slideshow here. All right. So that title actually comes from a book that I've recently published, From Hohokam to Hohokam. And Hohokam is a native word. It's a native O'odham word that refers to people from the past. And Hohokam is a term that archaeologists use to describe material culture from the past. And so what I want to do here kind of is present some of my research on the ecology and the demography of the people who lived in southern Arizona, as well as some contemporary thoughts about how they are related to people today and what all of this means for heritage and that sort of thing. So just to refresh your memory, the Hohokam is an archaeological term referring to a suite of material culture that we find in southern Arizona, primarily along the Salt and Gila River valleys and their main tributaries. So just a few sort of high points about the Hohokam. Lived in southern Arizona for more than 1,000 years, and really, when we say that it was 1,000 years, it's very likely that the ancestors of the Hohokam even lived there earlier than that. And as we will see, later in the paper, that their descendants have continued to live there since then. But the material culture that we can identify as what archaeologists define as Hohokam lasted from the early centuries of the Common Era up until around the mid-15th century. Now, our estimates, based on some of the research that I have done, are that there are about 40,000 people at peak population. This is a controversial estimate, and I'll just come right out and say that many of my colleagues dispute these numbers. Many of my colleagues would say that these numbers are too low, that there was actually more people than this, and I think it would not be uncommon for other researchers in this area to say there may have been twice as many people as that. That is possible. I don't dispute that. Our estimates we attempted to be to make an empirically based estimate, looking at the sites that we knew about and how many people we think lived there. Obviously, in archaeology, we never know everything. There are lots of sites we don't know about, lots of people that we can't count. But this is how many we can count. So I'm really okay with the idea that there were more people than this. And I think that, the question of whether there were more or less people than this really is kind of tangential to the larger problem, which is that there was population growth and then population decline. Whether it was 40,000 or 60,000 or 80,000, the important point to me is which direction was it going? Were they increasing or were they decreasing? They covered an area of more than 100,000 square kilometers, so a large area of the Sonoran Desert. And one of the things that they are most famous for in North American archaeology is their massive irrigation system. It was the largest irrigation system in prehistoric North America. And it's one of the most notable features when we talk about them, Hohokam collapse or something like that. One of the things that we're interested in is that irrigation system and why they seem to have stopped using it. So today, the center of the Hohokam world is around the modern day city of Phoenix. And as I may have mentioned earlier, the name Phoenix comes from the idea of the ancient myth of the firebird that would arise from the ashes of its predecessor. And it was given that name because when the earliest Anglo settlers came to this area in the late 1800s, they saw many, many ruins. Their firsthand accounts were that, there were ruins as far as the eye could see. And so the reason that they gave this area the name Phoenix was because they thought that a new civilization would rise from the ashes of that ancient civilization. Most of those ruins are long gone. The overwhelming majority of them have been destroyed with the rise of urban development in Phoenix, and prior to that, the rise of agriculture and plowing. A lot of these things were simply plowed into the ground, into farmers' fields. But there are a few of them left, and one of them here in the foreground of this photo is at Pueblo Grande, and you can see a platform mound there, and then next to it a museum, and then right behind it there you can see an irrigation canal. That irrigation canal is actually a reclaimed canal that is a completely modern contemporary canal providing irrigation water to the Phoenix area. But it actually is in the bed of an ancient Hohokam canal. This was one of the things that those early Anglo settlers did, was they basically just reclaimed that massive irrigation system and kind of cleaned it out and started using it again. Here is an artist's depiction of what some of these sites might have looked like, a site like Pueblo Grande back when it was at its peak of occupation. And you can see it's a large Pueblo type structure with a compound wall around it, and surrounded by vast fields filled with corn, cotton, crops like that. And this would have been a very prosperous place to live. A site like Pueblo Grande would have had hundreds of people, perhaps as many as a couple of thousand people. I don't think anyone really knows for sure, because we only know about a fraction of the site. But the main part of the site that we know of indicates that it was quite a large place, and it was located right at the head gate, or the entrance to one of the main canals, Canal System 2. The Hohokam had very distinctive material culture. So throughout the rise of the Hohokam in the first centuries of the Common Era, we see the development of distinctive material culture like this red on buff pottery. And this kind of thing is found throughout the Hohokam region. Thousands and thousands, millions of pieces of this stuff have been found. And it all kind of is made a particular way and designed a particular way. And that's the kind of thing that archaeologists look at and say, that's Hohokam. When we find that, that's what we mean by Hohokam. And it's different from pottery that people made in other places. Other material culture associated with the Hohokam include things like shell jewelry, shell bracelets, things like this. This shell was imported from the Sea of Cortez, perhaps the Pacific in California, but obviously it's not normally found in the Sonoran Desert. So this is indicative of their trade relations and their probably journeys to the Sea of Cortez to collect this material themselves, as well as salt and other things. But they had extensive trade relations. The Hohokam were not the only people who lived in this area. There were other people, the Yaqui and the Seri and the human tribes over in the Colorado River Valley and other people that they could have traded some of this material with, in addition to making their own sort of pilgrimage journeys to the Sea of Cortez. Some other things that are associated with the Hohokam, we have these slate pallets. I'm not sure anyone knows exactly what they were used for, but I think the best guess is that they were used for some kind of well, you might call it makeup, but some sort of application to the face, some sort of facial decoration or something like that. You can see on the lower left there, you've got copper bells. These came up from Mexico. They were probably not made by the Hohokam, but traded up from Mexico. On the right there, you can see a very intricately woven cotton shirt. The Hohokam grew a lot of cotton and appear to have worn cotton clothes, although that was never described historically, because the Hohokam were never described historically. They were no longer identifiable by this particular kind of material culture by the time Europeans showed up. But there's lots of evidence in terms of spindle whorls and that sort of thing that the Hohokam were growing cotton and making cotton clothing. Here is a photograph of one of those irrigation canals that is today abandoned, just out kind of in a vacant lot in Mesa, Arizona somewhere, I think is where this photo was taken. But you can see there's a person standing there, so you can kind of get a sense of the size of these things. These were large constructions, and this isn't even the largest one by any means. There were larger ones than this, but this is pretty typical. And you can imagine these were people who did not have metal tools. They did not have beasts of burden, wagons, or anything like that. They were moving this stuff with pointy sticks and baskets. And they moved a lot of dirt. And they maintained this irrigation system and built it and developed it over a span of many centuries. So this represents an absolutely massive investment of labor and skill and organization. And here you can see some of these canals in the lower right here. You can see where one of these canals has sort of been revived. In the upper left there is Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. This is right near Pueblo Grande, and this you can see where several of these canals are coming out. So you can see some of the abandoned traces. They're kind of right in the middle of the photograph, abandoned traces of multiple canals. So they would have to take them out at very specific locations where the water table was appropriately high, that they could get the water out of the river and onto the floodplain and up even onto higher terraces. But when they have those good locations like they did at Pueblo Grande, they could get this water out into canals that would go many miles off into the desert and irrigate thousands of acres of land. Here's some artist depictions of what these things might have looked like, and you can see that you know, there were all sizes of canals. These would have been the smaller kinds of feeder canals heading off into their fields, and using vegetation mats to sort of block the water one place to direct it to another place and that kind of thing, and ultimately would get out into their fields. And this probably would not have worked all year around. It wasn't necessary for it to work all year round, but they would capture water during periods of high flow, and you'd get just enough of that water during those periods of high flow to irrigate enough crops to, you know, kind of keep them through the rest of the year when they might not have been able to do this. Here, another artist's depiction of some of these head gates, you know, coming out of the water, or out of the river rather, and some of their, you know, the various kinds of fields and some of their structures in the background where they would have processed some of these foods and that kind of thing. So the Hohokam are one of the great American archaeology mysteries. There are lots of mysteries in American archaeology, but I would say the Hohokam rank right up there among the most mysterious of them. I'm sure you've heard of the mysteriously vanished Anasazi and Mississippian populations and so forth. The Hohokam are one of those mysteriously vanished people. You'll note that I put disappeared in quotations because I think it's kind of a problematic concept. You'll note I also put the term collapse in quotes because I think that's also kind of a problematic concept. But we want to understand, why did that happen? How did this come to be? Around the mid 1400s, that was before the discovery of the New World and conquest of the New World, I should say. The New World had been discovered, first of all, of course, by Native Americans, and then probably subsequently by, at least one other group. We know the Vikings made it. Probably at some point, Polynesians probably made it to South America. So, but most of those things didn't really have quite the impact that the European discovery did. So this happened before the European discovery and conquest by the Spanish. So we can't probably really attribute Hohokam disappearance to the Spanish. We have to find some sort of cause, that's local and indigenous to this place. Is related to this other question, which is the continuity question. The continuity question is the question of how were the Hohokam related to the Native Americans who live in this place today? And this has been a huge ongoing question ever since the Spanish first entered this region. They have been asking this question, and it's a source of great irritation to the Native Americans who live in Arizona today. So this is kind of where we're going to end up with this question. But here's an artist's depiction of Coronado arriving in the area. Of course, he's not meeting people. He's not meeting Hohokam people here. He is meeting probably Zuni people in this particular illustration, because interestingly, when the Spanish entered this area, they had native guides, and the native guides led them all around the Southwest, but curiously never took them into the Hohokam region. It took 150 years before the Spanish really entered into the Hohokam region in any significant way. And so that kind of makes us wonder what was going on. The Spanish were looking for people like the Hohokam, and the fact that they walked all around that area for 150 years and never met the Hohokam suggests pretty strongly to me that they were not doing the same kinds of things. They were not living in towns and using irrigation systems. That's the kind of thing the Spanish were looking for. But when Coronado shows up, of course, everything changes for Native Americans. That this begins the conquest, the introduction of diseases, as well as all manner of European oppression and conversion to Christianity and so forth. So 150 years after Coronado shows up, Father Kino shows up. Now, Father Kino is really the first European of any note to at least document his entrance into the area where the Hohokam had previously lived. But by this time, it's already 1690. When he arrives in this area, he identifies people living here, something on the order of 16 to 17,000 people who he identifies as Pima because of the language that they spoke. And he identifies this region as the Pimeria Alta. The high Pimeria, the sort of northern part of the Sonoran Desert. And of course, we don't have any photographs or anything of those people, but we have more recent historic photographs of that sort of fit the descriptions that Father Kino gave back in 1690, and he describes lots and lots of people living in this area. Not as many as we identified from the Hohokam. For example, I estimate 40,000 or so Hohokam. Many people would say that there were even more than that. Father Kino estimates somewhere in the neighborhood of 16,000, 17,000 people. So significantly fewer people, but still thousands of people living here, all along the same rivers and pretty much the same areas where the Hohokam had previously lived. One of the things that interested Kino and pretty much every explorer who came after Kino was Casa Grande. And here is one early artist's depiction of Casa Grande. Casa Grande is a large standing adobe ruin. There were many more of these. Casa Grande is really most notable because it was the last one standing, and therefore it sort of became iconic as the last of these great ruins of the Hohokam. But there were many others, and according to some accounts, some of them were even larger than Casa Grande. But Casa Grande is the one, still today, is the only one that is standing, and consequently it is the best known of these. And it really sort of shaped people's idea of what the Hohokam should have looked like, what Hohokam archaeology should have looked like, even though it's probably kind of unusual for a Hohokam structure. Certainly, does not represent many of the structures that common people lived in, especially in the earlier centuries. But it kind of became iconic for what we should expect Hohokam to look like. And it's very, very different from what the Pima people, who, by the way, I'll just say, we don't call them Pima people anymore. That's what Kino called them. Today, we call them the O'odham people. But the O'odham people who Father Kino described were living in structures more like this. So we see here on the bottom right. And these structures leave a very different kind of archaeological signature. So in that figure on the left, you can see that those people visiting this site are looking at these kind of oval rings of stones. This is more like the kind of structure that Kino saw people living in, and it's the kind of structure that the O'odham people were living in right up until the early 20th century, and is well documented historically and ethnographically. So what happened between giant multi-story structures like this, up to 4 stories tall with many rooms, and much more modest round pit houses like this, sort of single family dwellings? What happened to bring about that change? So we know that there's a significant decline in population. There's a significant change in the kinds of buildings that they built. They stopped building big structures like Casa Grande. They started making completely different kind of pottery. Now this pottery on the upper left there is what's called Roosevelt redware. And that is a kind of pottery that was sort of typical of the very end of the Hohokam occupation at places like Casa Grande. And there's lots and lots of this stuff around sites like Casa Grande. Now, the pottery on the lower right, it was made during the Hohokam period. It's just sort of a common plainware. But this was the kind of pottery that was more commonly used by the O'odham during the historic period, when Kino shows up and later ethnographically documenting the O'odham in this area is more like the kind of pottery that they used. Now, there were O'odham decorated pots, and they sometimes kind of get left out of the equation. But there appears, at least superficially, to be a pretty significant difference between the decorated pottery on the upper left that sort of became the hallmark of the classic period Hohokam, and the much more modest plainware on the lower right here that it was more typical of O'odham people. So again, something important seems to have happened. People don't make that kind of pottery on the upper left anymore. Instead, they make the kind of pottery on the lower right. So, you know, something else that's different. These kinds of things challenge archaeologists to answer questions. What happened? So back in 2002, I was hired by an organization now goes by the name Archaeology Southwest to develop a geographic information systems database. We called that the Coalescent Communities Database for reasons I don't need to go into here. But this is a database of all the large sites. We defined large as being anything over 12 rooms throughout the North American Southwest, extending from northern Mexico all the way up into southern Colorado and Utah, and dating between 1200 AD and 1600 or so AD. And you can see that, you know, lots and lots of sites throughout the Southwest. I think the last time I checked, and I am no longer responsible for this database, it's probably even bigger than this now, but the last time I worked on it, I think we had somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000 to 4,500 sites. So we had lots and lots of sites. The point of this was to get a big macro regional picture of what was going on in the Southwest. Because one of the questions, of course, that comes from any of these discussions of these mysteriously vanished people is, well, maybe they just moved somewhere else. Maybe we can see that if we stop just looking at the one little small area and look at the big picture. And sure enough, that's what happened. So here we're going to go through a series of population maps, and you can see the sort of the darkest blue, bluish purple population contours here are the densest populations, and the yellow contours are the lowest populations. So we can really kind of see where population was most densely concentrated in 50-year intervals, beginning in AD 1200 to 1250 in this case, and then we'll go in 50-year intervals up until the last interval. So here we can see right away, down there in the lower left part of this image, that highest population density is in the center. That's right in the Phoenix Basin, right where the highest concentration of Hohokam archaeology is located. There are other concentrations up there in the upper part of the image. That's that Mesa Verde region. Another concentration over to the right a little bit in the upper Rio Grande River Valley. And as we move through time here in these 50-year intervals, we're going to be able to see these population contours move around. And this should give us some insight into where people went. So one of the things that we're interested in is, what about those people up there at Mesa Verde? We talked about them too. Where did they go? So here we can see population starting to spread out a little bit, even growing a little bit in the late 1200s, but still in most of the same places that we've been talking about. In the lower part of this image, you can see a concentration there at Casa Grande, or Casas Grandes, or Paquime rather, that we talked about earlier in the semester. But now look, by the time we get to the early 1300s, look at the upper part of this image in the north, that Mesa Verde area, as well as the whole surrounding area of the San Juan River Valley, completely depopulated, at least according to these models. Now, one of the things I have to caution about this does not mean that nobody's living there. It just means that archaeologists can't find anybody. We can't find the material culture. We can't find the houses and the pottery and the stuff like that that we can date to that time period. There were likely people around, but there does seem to be something very significant going on, that all those people who lived up in the Mesa Verde area are gone now. They seem to have moved a couple of different places. Most prominently, you can see the numbers over on the right side of the image. That's that upper Rio Grande Valley. Some of them probably moved into that area. but some of them moved further south down into the Hohokam area. We can see that population growing down on the sort of lower left part of our image there in the Hohokam area. As we move into the late 1300s, we can see a big kind of gap opening up between what we're going to call the northern and southern Southwest. Now, really, it's kind of the northeastern Southwest up there in the Rio Grande Valley, and the southwestern Southwest down there in the Hohokam and places like that. That gap will expand, and at the same time that gap is expanding, we can see that Hohokam populations, as well as their neighbors at Paquimé and Trincheras and places like that, we can see them becoming more and more isolated. And then by the time we get to the late 1400s, we cannot really find anybody living in the southern Southwest anymore. Again, this doesn't mean that there was nobody there. We are virtually positive that there were still people there. In fact, I would say I'm completely positive that there were people there. There were thousands of people living there, but there were probably a lot fewer people living there than had been living there during the peak of the Hohokam period. And they seem to have been doing things very differently. And one of the things that they were doing differently is that they were not living in those big, densely packed sites that are easy for archaeologists to see and to date. They were not making that decorated pottery that, again, helps archaeologists date to different time periods as those styles change and everything. When we find that plainware pottery, sometimes it's very difficult to date that stuff because it could have been made between, 2,000 years ago up till 100 years ago. So again, dating is a real problem. They're living in those ephemeral, small structures that leave almost no archaeological traces. Very difficult to find, very difficult to date. So again, there were people living here, but they were doing things very differently than the Hohokam had been doing them, and there were significantly fewer of them. So this is the problem that we face as archaeologists. What happened? We get up into the time of Coronado's arrival, and this is pretty much what the southwestern world looks like. And these are exactly the people who the Spanish explorers describe. The pueblos of Zuni and Hopi and the pueblos along the Rio Grande Valley. That's who the Spanish describe when they first arrive in the region. Now, if we actually look at all those sites that I just talked about in that coalescent communities database and try to estimate how many people lived there at each interval, what we find, and don't trouble yourself too much about this graph because it's showing different people's estimates, but basically the estimate that I'm going to refer to is the heavier black line, the CDA. That's the old name of that organization. It used to be called the Center for Desert Archaeology, but that's the estimate that I created with my colleagues there a few years ago. And what we find is that, this is pretty much agrees with the other estimates, at least in terms of trends. Even if there are disagreements about exactly how many people there were and stuff, the trends seem pretty consistent. And that is that there was a population peak somewhere around the early 1300s, followed by a significant population decline, and that population decline happens before European diseases arrive on the scene. So we're going to have to attribute this population decline to something besides European disease. Now, this looks like a really dramatic thing. I mean, it's the kind of population decline that at first glance would make you think, holy cow, what happened to all those people? Where are the bodies? Or where did they go? We should expect to find them somewhere else. But when we go back and look at these maps, we don't find them somewhere else. A few of them maybe up at a place like Zuni. There's some evidence of Hohokam material culture traits appearing there, but not nearly enough to account for all of the people who seem to have vanished from the southern Southwest. So what happened to them? Well, one of the things that we learned about this, if you actually do the math on this and think about this, population is a function of fertility and mortality and migration. Well, we've sort of ruled out migration, at least to some degree, because we don't really see evidence of them showing up somewhere else. So we're back to fertility and mortality. One of the things that we can conclude from this, though, is that this population decline is actually quite reasonable and possible based on fairly modest annual changes in fertility and mortality. Basically, if your fertility diminishes somewhat and your mortality increases somewhat, not very much really, you can get significant population decline over a span of time. And so what we concluded from this is that, fairly modest changes in the order of a fraction of a percent per year would result in, over a span of 150 years, would result in a very significant depopulation. But it's a kind of depopulation that would not have seemed calamitous to the people who experienced it, because you have to imagine these are people who are living in villages of a few hundred people maybe. Some people die this year, some people are born this year, some years it's a little bit more one way, some years it's a little bit more the other way. On the whole left part of this graph, they have been experiencing mostly pretty gradual population growth. What that means is that fertility is very slightly greater than mortality. Again, barely noticeable, but over time it results in significant population growth. Then we see a transition, and basically those numbers get flipped. We see mortality at a slightly greater level than fertility. You can change those numbers by a very small amount. You're just tipping that ratio, just to change the balance a little bit. And over time, like I said, over 150 years that we're talking about, between the early 1300s and the mid 1400s, you can make most of those people disappear, so to speak, simply by virtue of not replacing their population from year to year. And that's kind of what we think about what happened to them in terms of their population. Well, why would that happen? Why would their fertility and mortality ratios change? Well, we have some interesting clues. And it goes back to Mesa Verde and that area up there in the Four Corners, the Kayenta and Tusayan areas up there to the north. When all of those people started migrating out of that area, and there was a drought up there that probably contributed to that migration. When they moved out of that area of the northern Southwest, and some of them moved down into the southern Southwest, they brought some of their material culture with them, including things like this kind of pottery that is called Maverick Mountain Polychrome. Now you might notice that this looks kind of similar to that Roosevelt redware that I was just showing you earlier that seems to be typical of the classic period Hohokam. Well, this seems to be a style. It's very different from the traditional Hohokam pottery, and so we can recognize it pretty easily. This starts to show up. This is typical of the northern Southwest, but it starts to show up in the Hohokam region in the early 1300s. There are other material culture traits. This is called a perforated plate. This is something that is typical of the northern Southwest, not the southern Southwest, not typical of the Hohokam, but it starts to show up in Hohokam sites. In particular, those found around the kind of the periphery of the Hohokam region. Other things. This is a kiva. This is a very famous structure at a place called the Davis Ranch site that was excavated back in the 1950s. This is a ritual structure that is associated with Puebloan people, those people up there at Mesa Verde and other places up in the northern Southwest. This is not the kind of thing that Hohokam people built. Well, suddenly these kinds of things start to show up around the edges of the Hohokam world in the early 1300s. We see transitions, interesting transitions in architecture. So it turns out during most of the earlier part of the Hohokam occupation, people had been living in those pit houses and building those ball courts that we described earlier and things like that. At the same time that we see those material culture traits from the northern Southwest starting to show up in the Hohokam world, we start to see the erection of platform mounds like this, and compound walls, more like the things that we see at places like Pueblo Grande and Casa Grande. And so basically the conclusion that we have come to, and this is based a lot on the research that my colleagues at Archaeology Southwest put together, is that those people from the northern Southwest, here identified as the Kayenta-Tusayan region in northeastern Arizona, when they started experiencing that drought in the late 1200s and early 1300s, they started migrating down into the valleys of southern Arizona. Now, a lot of them probably did not at first move right in with the Hohokam. They would have been different kinds of people, spoken different kinds of languages, had different kinds of religion and all kinds of different material culture. But they seem to have settled around the edges. And that's really basically what you can see here. So all those things I was just talking about, they start to show up around the edges. Yeah, that site of Davis Ranch ruin is kind of down in the lower right of this image. A lot of these northern material culture traits start to first appear around the edges of the Hohokam world, and we think it is because these immigrants start to show up and settle around the edges of the Hohokam world. And that basically what happened was that it caused people to take up a more defensive posture. Basically, these people moved in as refugees. There were probably never really all that many of them. We estimate maybe around 3,000 people or so, but in an area of 100,000 square kilometers, that's really not very many people. There was no reason for the Hohokam to be all that upset about this. But we do see some interesting changes. We see a shift towards a more defensive kind of architecture. We see a shift towards much more aggregated settlement, and that's where that term, the coalescent communities database, comes from. These are coalescent communities. They start aggregating into much denser concentrations and focusing a lot of their efforts on big irrigation communities. Whereas, for centuries prior to this, the Hohokam had practiced irrigation, but they'd also practiced a lot of other things, and they had lived in a variety of different kinds of sites spread around the landscape. They kind of stopped doing that, and they started putting a lot of their efforts into the irrigation along the big rivers, the Salt and Gila River in particular. Here is some of that defensive architecture that we see of those northern migrants showing up in the San Pedro River Valley. We never saw this kind of stuff earlier on, but as soon as this kind of thing starts to happen, the people who had been living in the lower San Pedro River Valley prior to this, people we might describe as Hohokam, they stopped doing a lot of the things that they had been doing. They had been farming up on the hills, farming agave and things like that. They stopped doing that. They start moving down into the river valleys, into big, concentrated, aggregated settlements. So this kind of tells us what's happening around the periphery of the Hohokam world. But what's happening in the center of the Hohokam world? Remember, that's where the modern-day city of Phoenix is. It's a little bit harder to read because a lot of the archaeology was destroyed here. Mainly what we know about this area is from the really big sites and the big irrigation sites. But from studying those big irrigation sites, we can tell some kind of interesting developments that occurred down there. So one of the things I want you to do, this is another time series of population maps. And what we have here, beginning the same period in 50-year intervals, we're going to start with 1200 AD. In this case, that blue line is the Salt River Valley. This is the center of the densest part of the Classic period Hohokam occupation. And what we have here, those green lines are the irrigation canals, and the sort of yellow fried egg looking things are population concentrations. And we can see that in the earliest interval here, the population is fairly well distributed all around the irrigation system. Now, again, we don't know where everybody lived, and almost certainly there are lots of places that, we have not documented, and therefore we cannot account for population there. But this gives us at least a sense of trends, where they were living at different times, where the greatest concentrations of them were living at different times. We can see in the earliest period, they're pretty well distributed around the irrigation system. This is before all those refugees from the north start to show up. When those refugees from the north start to show up, one of the first things we see is a big bump of population, that big concentration at that reddish part right in the middle. That is Pueblo Grande. We move into our next interval. We can see that Pueblo Grande is still big. That other big red blotch over to the right, that's Mesa Grande. These things you'll notice are right near the heads of these big irrigation canals. You got a big irrigation system going off to the north and other big irrigation systems coming off to the south. Actually, there are several irrigation systems, but these big sites of places like Pueblo Grande and Mesa Grande are located near the head gates of these big irrigation systems. And what seems to be happening here is this process of coalescence. These people are crowding down into these big irrigation communities that control the intakes of the canals. What that means, though, is that they're putting greater and greater stress on those lands. They're creating greater and greater hygiene problems for themselves. Remember, these are people without sewage systems, without modern medicine. more and more of them are living in more and more concentrated conditions, putting greater and greater emphasis on irrigated crops and less emphasis on hunting and gathering, more dispersed wild crops out in the desert. Then notice what starts to happen. We get into the late 1300s and we see that population starting to decline. And then very interestingly, our last period of occupation in the lower Salt River Valley, the only people that we can convincingly identify still living in this area are concentrated not at the intake locations of the canals, but down at the ends of the canals. That's a very interesting problem, because if you're living down at the end of the canal and farming down there, that means you have to maintain the entire canal system. Now, why would you do this? There are a lot of reasons why you might do this. One reason, the brown patches here are what were described in the early 1900s by Anglo-American farmers as the Salt River adobes. Now, what these things are thick concentrations of clay soil that are very difficult to irrigate and cultivate. It's really thick, dense stuff. It gets very waterlogged, and it's not good for farming. Well, you might notice that the greatest concentrations of this stuff are located right along those canals close down to the river, not along the canals further out towards the ends and stuff. And so what the people who have studied these Salt River adobes have concluded is that these are the remnants of ancient irrigation. Basically, people irrigated these lands for so long, for so many centuries, that they basically just built up these thick clay deposits that made it harder and harder to farm down near the river at the intakes of the canal locations. And so consequently, they would have had to move away from those things to continue to find good irrigation land, good farmland. And so as they moved away from the river out towards the ends of the canals, that meant that they still had to maintain the entire canal system in order for this to function. You can probably imagine how difficult this is getting to be. Their population is declining. They have to maintain this huge irrigation system to farm fields farther and farther away from the river. Not to mention the fact that there's evidence of flooding. These rivers have always flooded, but now you're dealing with a different kind of problem. The areas down close to the river, these are going to be, the areas where these Salt River adobes are located. The areas where you've got these big concentrations of people living are going to be the places that are most impacted by these floods. We know there were some pretty significant floods probably in the late 1300s. And so what we see here is a real challenge to people trying to live in this area. They're trying to continue operating an irrigation system that they have been using for hundreds of years, but it's becoming harder and harder to do because they have had to move away from the river, and so they're having to maintain this huge irrigation system with a smaller and smaller population. You can easily imagine that this becomes a no-win situation. There's no reason to continue doing this eventually. And we think that eventually that's what happened, is they basically just decided to go somewhere else. There's evidence that the dynamics of these river systems were changing at the same time that the lower Salt River was becoming an unattractive place to live for all of these reasons. The Gila River may have been entering into a different hydrological cycle and may have been a more attractive place to live. And so people may have moved over to the Gila River. We can see what some of the consequences would have been if we start to model where people lived with regard to the canal intakes. And what we see is that if you look on your y-axis there, this is where the average distance that people would have had to walk from where they lived to get down to the intakes. They had to maintain the intakes. So if you imagine a canal system is many miles long, well, you have to maintain the whole thing. You have to maintain the intake and the head gates and all that kind of stuff to get water all the way out to the end. This is how far they would have had to walk to do this. So earlier on, people are kind of spread out. We see over there to the left of the graph, 1200 AD, people on average had to walk, about 5 to 6 kilometers. That's a ways, but it's not an unreasonable amount. That's about the maximum amount that we usually expect agriculturalists will walk to tend to their fields and stuff like that. So that's sort of manageable. Then we see that distance actually decreases down to around 4 kilometers. This is probably a function of that coalescence. As people are crowding down to be closer to the river, which was a defensive response to the arrival of those immigrants, as those immigrants start to move in around the edges, we see this sort of cascade effect of people moving closer and closer down to the river to get the best lands, first dibs on the water and all that kind of stuff. That's what we see there around 1250. And then we see that they have to gradually move farther and farther and farther away, to the point where at the end of our occupation of these communities that we can identify archaeologically, they're walking close to 10 kilometers on average to get down to where they have to maintain the intakes of these canal systems. That's about twice as far as agriculturalists will usually walk to tend things like this. So you can see that, this is basically a graph of the costs and benefits of continuing this irrigation. And so we think that that's basically what happened, that their system just became impractical and it was no longer profitable to do this in the Salt River Valley. And basically out of sort of a second stage response to climate change up in the north, they had responded to these refugees in a sort of a defensive way. Now, this is really kind of an awful thing if you think about it, because the Hohokam could have easily absorbed 3,000 refugees with no problem and continued to live as they had lived and probably continued to prosper as far as we know. But they didn't. They reacted defensively and inappropriately, I would say, to the arrival of immigrants. Sound familiar? Same kind of things going on today. But now we got this other question. When we talked about that word Hohokam, what does this actually mean? And I've told you that Hohokam means a certain set of material culture traits, certain kind of architecture, certain kind of pottery and shell jewelry and so on and so forth that archaeologists are able to find when they excavate sites. But what does this mean for people who are living there in the area today? I told you we were going to talk about Native Americans. What do they think about this? Many people have studied the O'odham. One of the first ethnographers of this region was a guy named Frank Russell, and he studied the O'odham back in the early 1900s. One of the many people to document this word, he was not the first to record the word, but he was one of the early anthropologists, and basically concluded that the word Hohokam means those who are gone. So when the first anthropologists arrived in the region and started asking local people, well, who built these places? Who built this irrigation system? Who built Casa Grande? The local people said, those who are gone, in their own language, which was Hohokam. They didn't probably really mean all that much about it in terms of material culture or something like that. They weren't saying, oh, the people who make that kind of pottery as a distinct ethnic group or anything. They were basically just making a sort of a common sense statement. Like, if I ask you, who built some, abandoned house somewhere, you'd probably say, I don't know, people who aren't there anymore, I guess. That's kind of what they were saying. Well, that didn't mean at all that, they didn't identify with those people, just in the same way that you might identify as an American with the people who built an abandoned house in your neighborhood. And this has become a real point of contention and frustration for Native Americans today. And so this is a photograph of a guy named Joe Joaquin, who was an O'odham elder, and one of the first people who really got me to thinking about this subject. And he was at a conference many years ago, back around 2003 or 2004, I don't remember exactly. But he came to a conference of archaeologists. This is very common among archaeologists in their conferences to invite Native Americans to present their ideas on the subject. And Joe Joaquin came and said, why do you keep asking what happened to the Hohokam? We're doing fine, thank you. And actually, we'd probably be a lot better off if you left us alone. So that got me to thinking, yeah, how do we reconcile this idea that people can be descended from the Hohokam, as archaeologists think of it, and yet still we can ask this interesting question: what happened to the Hohokam? How can both of those things be true? We have lots of evidence of Native beliefs about this subject. One of the people that Frank Russell interviewed was a guy named Thin Leather. And he talked about many of the oral traditions that were known to him and other elders of his time. There are many rituals associated with these oral traditions that O'odham people have been carrying on for centuries. If you read these oral traditions, they are actually very enlightening. And I think that they actually tell us a lot about what happened to what archaeologists call the Hohokam and what the O'odham people call their ancestors. They very explicitly describe a period of population growth. They describe environmental problems, including drought, famine, and sickness. They describe at least one, probably more, great floods. And furthermore, the division between two different groups of people that ended up, kind of suffering different consequences. And the ones who suffered most were the people who lived, the original people, so to speak, who had been there all along, and probably those people who lived down close to the river while the other people were kind of crowding around on the periphery. Those people who suffered most from the floods were led by their gods, in some cases to the underworld, in other cases to the south, depending on which oral tradition. And then the other group of people who had probably been the more recent arrivals, again, probably those people from the north who followed different gods, had returned to the high country, the mountains, and probably to the north. And furthermore, these oral traditions identify the group that went to the south or the underworld as the Hohokam, and they identify the Hohokam as being ancestral to the O'odham people today. And the others, who they often referred to as the Hohokam, have a northern or Puebloan affiliation, people from that area, in northeastern Arizona. And then, ultimately they talk about a great battle where the Hohokam, the ancestors of the O'odham, had returned from the south to conquer the Hohokam, who lived in those big great houses like Casa Grande, and kind of chased them away. This is there's a fairly coherent story. There are lots of oral traditions, and they all sort of tell slightly different versions of it, but there's a fairly coherent story here of what happened that I think fits what archaeologists have figured out about this, remarkably closely, in my estimation. And, as one O'odham ethnographer phrased it, there's this puzzling aspect to it, that the O'odham are maddeningly both the same and different from the Hohokam. How can this be? How can they be both the same and different? Today, the Hohokam is used by Native people in the area, and they're pretty explicit about it. That when they use the term Hohokam, they're not talking about archaeological materials. They're not talking about pots and houses and stuff like that. They're talking about people. So this term has really come to mean their ancestors more than it means artifacts. And there are 4 southern tribes. Each has their own museum, and you'll notice that they use the term Hohokam in 2 of these museums. The other 2 museums use the term Himdag, which refers to their way of life, the way that they have survived in the desert for all these centuries. So they're very conscious about their heritage and their long heritage in this area of the Sonoran Desert. And if you go into these museums, you'll notice that they really don't have a lot of materials that you might expect to find in sort of typical museums. If you go into the Arizona State Museum or the Heard Museum or something like that, you'll see lots and lots of pottery and projectile points and shell jewelry and things like that. There's not nearly as much of that stuff in these museums that the Native Americans run. Instead, they're much more focused on contemporary art and their more recent history. They do include all of that stuff that archaeologists call Hohokam. That's part of their heritage, but they don't jump over it. If you go into the Arizona State Museum, you're more likely to see kind of a leap over centuries of history. Whereas in these Native museums, they don't leap over it that way. They really include all of it, and from yesterday right straight on back through generation, and they include a lot of discussion of Native American participation in the U.S. military and things like that. So a very different understanding of their heritage. Instead of sort of isolating Hohokam as some mysteriously vanished thing in the past, they tell a much more continuous story of their connection to it. So how can they be connected to it? How can both of these things have happened? How can the Hohokam have mysteriously vanished, and yet they have 30,000 or so living descendants in the area today? Well, one thing that we first have to understand is the sort of quantitative aspects of ancestry. And so if you think about here, what I mean in this graph, this is an ancestry fan. If you ever do like an ancestry.com type thing or something, if you try to figure out who your parents are and your grandparents and great grandparents and so on and so forth, those numbers increase exponentially. So ego to some power here, some exponent, refers to this idea. You have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents, and so on and so forth. That number grows exponentially. If you grow that number exponentially, back to the time that Casa Grande was built, this all kind of depends on how long you think a generation is, which we don't really have, very precise numbers at, but let's say somewhere on the order of, 20, 25 years or something like that per generation. If you grow your ancestry exponentially in this way, what you come to is that any O'odham person living today, as well as yourselves and anybody else living today, is going to have about 100 million ancestors at the time that Casa Grande was built. Now, there was never anything like 100 million people living, in the Hohokam region. What this means is that there's a great deal of overlap, that basically cousins were marrying cousins a lot. And so there's a great deal of overlap. So there were never 100 million ancestors, strictly speaking, in terms of 100 million individuals. But there were 100 million and even more. I mean, Casa Grande is like the last part of it, right? The further back in time you go, the more and more ancestors you count. There were that many ancestral relationships. So you may be related to these ancestors in a variety of ways because of all those cousins marrying cousins, which, by the way, is not something that, just happens among Native Americans or something like that. All of our ancestors had cousins marrying cousins up until relatively recently. So all of that overlap results in the fact that we have an astonishing number of ancestors and that we are connected to those ancestors through an absolutely astronomical, complex, quantitative ancestry. So this sort of accounts for part of the problem. The O'odham today are connected to their ancestors in this region. A huge, huge number of ancestral relationships. Now, the other interesting aspect of this is that there were a lot more people living there in earlier times. So, for example, when Father Kino shows up, this is just a list of the different groups of people that Father Kino identified. You'll notice one of those groups he identifies as the Pima, but then he even subdivides them into different groups. But then there are all different other kinds of groups, many of whom we have no record of today. But there were many different groups of people living here in this area. Father Kino was accompanied by a guy named Juan Manhe, who kept his own records, and he counted a whole bunch of other people. So none of the people on this list are the same people who were on the other list. So there were dozens and dozens of groups of people identified living throughout this area. And so we can get a much clearer sense of, now, if we look at those oral traditions, we try to make sense of those oral traditions of all those people coming and going, Hohokam and O'odham, and all the different groups of them that they described, it becomes clearer that there were many different groups of people moving in and out of this area. Some of them from the north, some of them from the south and the east and west. They were constantly moving through this area. And so it's really unrealistic of us to expect that one of these groups of people has remained a discrete population, through centuries and centuries. And if we kind of do the math on this, one of the overwhelming features that comes out of our consideration of oral tradition, as well as ethnography and just looking at contemporary O'odham senses of heritage, is that there was a great deal of intermarriage. People were always marrying into other groups. There were a lot of orphans adopted from other groups. There was a great deal of mixing of these populations. Now, you don't have to have very much of this mixing over time to end up with a great deal of a blended population. So the math here basically is, if you want to know how pure your population is over any span of time, you take 1 minus population to the exponent, where P is the percentage of endogamous marriage, basically the number of people who are marrying within their group times some number of generations. And so what this means, like if 1 in 10 people marries someone outside the group, you can run it through this formula and figure out if that happens every generation, if 1 in 10 people marries outside of the group every generation, how long does it take to get some degree of blended population? And when we do this math, it's very revealing. And what we find is that even if only 1 in 10, or even if only 1 in 20 people were marrying outside their group, having children with someone who was not from their own identity group, in the span of time since the Hohokam ruins were occupied, more than 90% of the population would be of mixed ancestry. So that's how they get to be maddeningly both the same and different. They are the same as the Hohokam, and they are also different from the Hohokam. They have ancestors through all that, astronomically complex ancestry. They have ancestors from those northern Puebloan people. They have ancestors from the Yuman people over in the Colorado River Valley and Mesoamerican populations to the south. They have ancestors from all of those groups. But most importantly, they have ancestors from this area where they have lived for centuries. I mean, that's going to be the dominant group. Obviously people are, marrying and having babies with the group, people who live around them. And so even though lots of people have moved in and out of this area, the people who remain there today, the O'odham people, are more likely than anyone else in the world to be directly related and descended from the Hohokam. So what does it mean to say the Hohokam collapsed? Our question has become vastly more complex. I think that we can make some interesting demographic and ecological claims about what happened to cause population decline, what happened to cause them to change their economic strategies with regard to irrigation and things like that. But we really cannot say that they disappeared in any sense. They have more than 30,000 descendants living in the same place today. So we really have to kind of tease these ideas apart and distinguish between archaeology and heritage. They mean kind of two different things. So I've talked a long time about this, a little bit more than an hour, I'm sorry to say. I'm going to stop this presentation and sign off for now. I'll come back and talk to you guys again on Monday. Meanwhile, I hope you have a great weekend.